The following episode is a rebroadcast from a previous BLAW Live. For the next several weeks, we will be presenting an encore presentation of Bishop Lawrence Ward's series on biblical justice. This week, part 1 of the Call for Biblical Justice with Sean Michael Watkins. We hope you enjoy the discussion.
This is Brother Sean Watkins, Reverend Brother Elder Pastor Sean Watkins, and he is from Austin, Texas, or Houston, Texas. He was raised in Houston, Texas. I guess he's in Austin now. We're so glad to have him because this is a very important subject. And so, just a little bit about him. He earned a BA in African American Studies and History, and he served on staff for the InterVarsity Christian Fellowship for 12 years, and has a variety of roles, and he actually speaks nationally in serving Black students and staff. He believes that his primary calling in life is to strengthen the Black voice at the multi-ethnic table, and that's an awesome thing. Strengthening the Black voice, that's a tremendous call. And he also has an earned master's degree from Fuller Theological Seminary, and he's actually beginning a doctorate program in 2021 coming up. And so we'll be looking at Dr. Sean Watkins very shortly. And so you want to keep that name in your memory because he's on to some great things. Tremendous man of God, just really lays out the word, and it's just a tremendous asset to the kingdom. And so Sean, just thank you so much for being a part of BLAW Live tonight as we talk about this whole issue of social justice. And so we have the ALC family, Abundant Life family, and our friends are with us tonight. And I know some others that are going to be joining us from different parts of the country. And we invite you to be a part of this. And thank you so much, all of you, for being a part of this very important conversation. So, Pastor Watkins, good to see you.
Good to see y'all. It took me a second, I had to catch my breath. I haven't seen y'all in a while, so I looked up. I heard Virginia's voice on the phone a couple of times, but we haven't seen each other face to face in a minute. So, and to see both of y'all together, the emotions. It took me a minute. Or as my friends would say, all the onions. Somebody was cutting these onions around me all of a sudden. So, but it's good to be here. Good to see all of you. I am humbled and honored for the opportunity. I think, like a number of us, there's some wisdom and perspective that we can bring to the conversation, but there's also just the reality that we just need to be together, not just as Christians, but also as people of color. These are increasingly trying times, and in the midst of what seems like a chaotic presidential administration and also a global pandemic, we are still having to advocate for Black lives and for the sacredness of Black bodies. And so it's just a gift and a privilege just to be really amongst family and to have this conversation. So thanks truly for inviting me.
Oh, great. So what is this call that you have to really strengthen the Black voice in this multi-ethnic table? That's a very unique call, and I really appreciate that. So tell us a little about that.
I laughed because I think I was laughing when you said it, because I think Virginia has met a lot of people over the years. I call her Virginia. I've just known her forever and a day. I think she met people for years, and I think she knew I was a fan. But I remember we were on the Black Campus Ministries Servant Leadership Team. We had just been appointed at the same time, and you can type Virginia's name into Google, and she pops up on 75 pages. You type my name into Google, and it's some random white guy that's in a band that sings the guitar, plays the guitar, and like sings with his sister. Nobody knows who I am. And I don't know how she found my bio. I don't know how she found my website. I think we were talking about BLAW. And that one phrase, and she looked at me like I was the prophet of the Lord. And ever since then, she both has been a champion, an encourager, a pusher to help me pursue God's purpose for my life. So, I think that idea of strengthening the Black voice at the multi-ethnic table, it really is deeply personal for me. And I always share my own story. I had these upper middle class Black parents in Houston, Texas, and Dad's a lawyer and a partner in his own law firm. Mom is a teacher, got her master's degree and was teaching. And they both made unwise choices and got a divorce. And we moved out of the suburbs into the hood. And Dad's an alcoholic, not a Christian, never been. Mom is a devout Christian, but parents got divorced, and she began a drug addiction, really, that started from the time I was 5 until the time I was 30. And so I had these parents, these Black parents, with upper middle class values that taught me the value of education and fine arts and travel and reading and writing and just really the classics. But, you know, I can spot a crack house a mile away. I have an internal radar for when the police are nearby. I don't need an electronic one. I'm like, you know, I think the cops are close. Slow down. Sure enough, they're around the corner looking for somebody. I know which red lights to run in Third Ward in Houston. Otherwise, you will get robbed if you wait. So, but I didn't know how to communicate that. I didn't know that something was not quite right with the way in which I was growing up, really until I think I got to college and I met other Black students and was like, oh, you know, both your parents are married to each other. And they both, you know, are parents of you. Y'all live in a house. They both have cars. You don't know what drugs look like. You've never seen crack cocaine or marijuana. Like, you've never heard gunshots or sirens at night. What's going on? And so that began questions in me. And at the same time I was in college and my faith took off through a ministry of university that was serving Black students, I also started taking African American studies classes. And I remember, I will never forget it for the rest of my life, Dr. Ed Gordon said in Introduction to African American Studies, in this class, we will study Black people, why we are the way we are, how we got here, and if we have enough time, a couple of things we can do to change it. And he put to language culturally what I knew was not right, but I couldn't even articulate it. And so you couple that with a contextualization of the gospel that serves African and African American students, and I found my niche. I found my passion. Came on staff within a varsity, and, you know, fell in love with the ministry, the organization, and the ethics. And as time progressed, I realized that the issues that were going on that were affecting Black students were also affecting Black staff in terms of contextualization of resources, our funding policies, the things in which bonded Virginia and I very quickly when she came on staff. And so I left in 2010 from InterVarsity because of funding, a systemic and structural issue that organization still struggles with. Came on staff at a Black church, but there was a shooting on UT's campus here in Austin. And I was concerned about my students, and it pulled me back to the campus. I realized my heart was still there. And I got appointed to be a regional coordinator overseeing ministry to Black college students in Texas, Arkansas, and Oklahoma. And the week that I got hired, Trayvon Martin was killed in Florida. And I went from being an underfunded Black male staff in Texas to one of the few people, just like Reverend Dr. Virginia Ward, became a national spokesperson for all things Black in InterVarsity. And in the midst of speaking, in the midst of serving the Black community and translating those issues to the white community, I realized there was a giant chasm there. And because my parents had given me those upper middle class values, but the context in which they've been lived out was the hood, I realized I could code switch in ways in which others couldn't. And I knew that I had an ethical, a spiritual, a theological responsibility really to stand in the gap and to serve both communities. And to be a bridge builder. And, you know, that ebbs and flows. Being a bridge builder means you get walked on. And so sometimes your boy, like it's the color purple, I will pack up a bag, time to go. You know, sometimes I need a break, but it's a gift, it's a calling, it is a blessed burden, and it's one that I'm grateful to have and to share.
Wow, that's great. That's great. So we're going to get into some meat now. And we are going to talk about what is happening in America today following the murder of a brother, a father, a son, George Floyd. What's happening from your perspective? And we're seeing rallies. I just got off the news broadcast from Boston. They had thousands of people walking through and doing demonstrations. Thank God it was peaceful. But what, from your perspective, what's actually happening right now from your perspective?
You know, I am of two minds of the situation. First and foremost, from a personal perspective, I'm 37, and I think we've all seen, we are aware of the reality of Black life in America. Depending on our age and stage, it has hit all of us in some way, shape, or form. As my mother told me 5 years ago, she has forgotten the names of all the unarmed Black people that have been killed in this country. And so we know that there is a narrative of systemic and structural injustice. But before I get to that, I think George Floyd is hitting me in a very personal and visceral way. In Virginia, I don't know if I told you, we went to the same high school, and I think it was probably a day or two after he died that the report started to come out and said, "Hey, he's from Houston." And then my cousin texted me and said he went to Yates, our high school in Houston. I was part of the class of 2000. My cousin Leslie was the class of 92, and George Floyd was the class of 93. And she remembers him. As a matter of fact, he was at her high school graduation in 92, and so was I. So we breathed the same molecules of air at the same time. My mother texted me, actually, she called me this past Saturday and said, "Sean, your first grade teacher, Miss Sexton, is on the news. She was George Floyd's second grade teacher. She is on the news right now showing his report card and his ideas and dreams that he had for what he wanted to be when he grows up." Because, you know, teaching in the 70s and 80s, that's old school. You keep everything because you love your babies that much. And so I hopped on the internet and said, "This Miss Sexton, I have not seen her since I was in the first grade." So I have not seen that woman in 31, 32 years. And my first grade teacher is on the news talking about him. And so there's a visceral sense in which, if not but for the grace of God, and to be honest, I am a light-skinned Black man, I still get stopped, but I don't get stopped as much. There's a privilege that I have from not being on the darker end of the spectrum, as is the case for all of our brothers around the world. They are overly policed on every continent. But it's a visceral, emotive, I really don't have words for it. It's just, this is the first time it has been that close to home. And so I'm trying to process, what in the world does that mean? And it's one thing to say it can be any of us, but it truly could be any of us. Like, it really could have been me. It still can be. And so there's some sense in which that is viscerally painful and with me. I think there's another sense in which, from a broader theological and ethical perspective, I like imagery. We are playing Monopoly. Do not pass go. Do not collect $200. We have not stepped into the 21st century. When Michael Brown was killed and Ferguson lit up, every older Black person said, "Oh no, baby, this is y'all's Ferguson. This was our Watts." They said, "We've seen it before." And you go through the ethics of what was happening in the country and society, and all the calls for Black Lives Matter and social justice issues, and Colin Kaepernick taking a knee, and the professional consequences for him in that respect. And here we are in the midst of a global pandemic, in the midst of this toxic presidential administration, and you still are finding a frequency of unarmed Black people being killed right now, from Ahmaud Arbery to George Floyd to Breonna Taylor. The list goes on. And so I think God is a God of justice, and I think these things, sadly, the shedding of Black blood, sadly, is continuing. But I think God is calling America to account in a very incredible way. That America will repent one way or another. It's an empire, and we know that. But I think the Lord is keeping them in a holding pattern, because He's exposing the sins of the nation, the original sin of the nation, which is not just slavery. That is white supremacy. That's how the country was founded. That is the original sin of America. And the Lord is illuminating that, and the world is watching. And we have been weighed on the scales, and we have been found wanting.
Wow, that's amazing. So talk to us a little bit about, and I'm hearing these two terms, and one is social justice, of course, and then we have biblical justice. Is it just kind of just throwing around the names? Justice is justice, and social is social. Is biblical justice different from social justice? And what's your thoughts around that terminology?
Bishop, I'm glad you asked. Let's see if I can share something here. If I can, I'm gonna try to share my screen. Hang on. Let's see if it'll let me. Because I created a PowerPoint. Let's see. It may not let me. Here, let's do the old-fashioned way. We got notes. I grew up on projectors, so I have no problems. We'll do this. So I think probably when we think about this whole idea of justice, there's a number of ways in which they can come across. And I like what Mortimer J. Adler said in his timeless classic, How to Read a Book. he said more often than not, miscommunication occurs because even though we use the same words, we have different meanings and different definitions for them. And so I thought about when we were kind of engaging in this, I typed in justice into Google to see what came up. And the first thing that came up was not the definition. It was not Botham John or George Floyd, anything that's going on right now. There is a clothing store named Justice, and it is for teenage girls. And I thought that is eerily prophetic of what it means to be a part of America, that justice not only is redefined, but justice can be purchased. And that's indicative of the United States of America right now. In terms of what Merriam-Webster defines it, they say that justice is the maintenance or the administration of what is just, especially by impartial adjustment or conflicting claims, or the assignment of merited awards or punishments. In other words, it is the quality of being just. It's the quality of being impartial or fair. Who carries those things out? Police officers, judges, lawyers, and elected officials. We trust them to be the ambassadors, the dictators, the demonstrators, the enforcers of justice. But as we've been talking about, we have to be on the earth for very long to be able to see that. From Trayvon Martin to Tamir Rice, Emmett Till, Eric Garner, Renisha McBride, the list goes on, that there's a cascade, a system failure when it comes to justice in the United States. And it fails not just at the individual level, it also fails at the systemic and structural level, right? It fails across race and ethnicity lines. Black people make up 13% of the population, but we make up 50% of the prisons. It's statistically not possible unless we were being overly policed, which is what Michelle Alexander talks about in New Jim Crow, mass incarceration in the age of colorblindness, as well as Brian Stevenson in his seminal work, Just Mercy. And so we see over and over and over again that it's a racial problem, it's an ethnic problem, it's also a socioeconomic problem. And you guys saw this in Boston. You had the owner of the New England Patriots get caught in a massage parlor in Florida on tape, on not possible, not coming out, on tape, which they will not release. Thank the Lord, we don't need to see that, but on tape. And because he's a billionaire, there were no consequences. And so what Michelle Alexander says in her book, which is absolutely right, she said, them without the capital get the punishment. If you don't have the money, you do capital punishment, but if you got capital, you may be all right. And so we know that justice is distorted without question. When it comes to biblical justice, I think to answer your question, social justice is encapsulated in that, but biblical justice is different. God in his sovereignty did not give us the Bible in a Western way. In other words, we can't just open the Bible and say, justice is, First Bishop 2:5 says justice. God never did that. He does not dictate what these things are. He demonstrates them. He gives us images of what justice can look like. And there are over 1,000 passages in the Bible that talk about justice, over 1,000, Old and New Testament. We see that justice, it first appears in Genesis 18:19, when the Lord says of Abraham, "For I have chosen him that he may command his children and his household after him to keep the way of the Lord by doing righteousness and justice." To keep the way of the Lord by doing righteousness and justice. And I'll give you one more, that famous one from Micah 6:8. He has told you, O man, what is good, and what does the Lord require of you but to do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God. In short, biblical justice is an attribute of God. What is missing in Western society and American society that we see in Scripture is that justice is directly tied to the character of God, that justice flows out of who God is, and it should flow out of us who are in relationship with him. In other words, we demonstrate justice to the degree that we know God. And to the degree in which we do not demonstrate or live out justice, God is absent in our lives. The Hebrew word for it really is mishpat, and that just means divinely righteous action. And that's really what's depicted over and over and over again, Old Testament and New Testament. One of the things I was looking at too was there are the two incidents that probably best describe justice. Obviously the Exodus, but the other one is the coming of the Lord Jesus. And we can talk more about that here in a little bit, because I don't want this to be a monologue, but a dialogue and a discussion. But the ways in which Jesus demonstrates justice, that's what biblical justice is. His concern for the marginalized, for the poor, his central announcement in Luke 4, "Hey, ladies and gentlemen, let me have your attention. Set the captives free, loose the chains of bondage." this has been fulfilled in your hearing. He is saying from up front, my primary mission is one of justice. And he flips the tables, all the marginalized, the poor, the orphans, the widows, the immigrants. He says they will now be front and center. And so you see that at the core, God's concern is for the margins, and as a consequence, that includes social justice. Last thing I'll say, and then I'll pass it back to you, Bishop, is that I think what the West tends to, how they misconstrue what justice is. Justice in the Bible is typically defined in multiple ways, but how theologians typically can agree on it really is of two ways. One of them is distributive justice, that we take all the resources and make sure they are given out evenly amongst every ethnic group, tribe, gender, culture, etc. The other one is corrective justice or criminal justice, that there's punishment, then there has got to be consequences for those actions. And what the West has done, it has ignored distributive justice, especially in our seminaries, and it's only focused on criminal justice, right? That's a big problem in conservative, mainstream evangelical circles. They are obsessed with criminal justice and not so much with distributive justice. But you have to have both. They are two sides of the same coin. If you take away distributive justice and only focus on the criminal, then we evaluate marginalized people based on our data and our statistics. But if we evaluate them both with distributive and corrective or criminal justice, then the question becomes, what have we done to care for the least of these, which is what Jesus said. If we spend enough time caring about the poor, the orphans, the marginalized, the widows, maybe they wouldn't engage in the criminal activity the ways in which they are suspected of doing, not even proven that they're suspected of doing, and that will create a more just society. And because we don't have that, we have this imbalance nationally that we cannot seem to get past. We are in a holding pattern. And the same questions that Dr. King spoke of in the 1950s and 60s. His last book, Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community, wrote it in 1967. It's like he wrote it yesterday. I mean, it is timeless and prophetic because we have not dealt with the issues of old. And that's where we are. Well, I think that's why we're here right now. Is we never dealt with the ghosts of the past, and they will stay with us until we repent of them as a nation.
Wow, that's great. Thank you for that definition. For those of you out there, this is great. It is very clear. For those of you out here, I want you to just kind of go to your chat box, and if you have questions, and maybe the questions could be around what you're seeing happening, what you're thinking about, but we also want to pull on this wonderful man of God and his wisdom on this subject of justice and biblical justice and looking at where we are. I have one more question before the chats start coming in. I would say, when it comes to the church, okay, when it comes to the church, all right, here's something that I'm very concerned about. I'm talking with many leaders who are white businessmen, white churches, business leaders of all types. And there's this sense of kind of like, whoa, what can I do? What can I do? In fact, one leader, I admired his honesty. He said, you're the only one I could call because I think that some of the Black folks that I've been calling, talking to, are sick and tired of me asking them, I should say, what can I do? And so what are we going to do with this whole impasse? It seems though we get to the rallies, we get to this place, we're doing the protests, and then now when it comes to putting some feet to our feet to it, it somehow gets lost. We said that we're fed up with when Trayvon Martin died. We're fed up with Eric Gardner, and we had some deaths since then. And what do you think needs to happen right now? What do you think?
Let me come at it a different way so the Black people don't jump on me. So I need to we'll come to the whites, we'll come to Black people. We'll come at it a different way so more people don't come for me. So I got the opportunity to speak at Indian Pentecostal Church in Houston, Texas, about 7 or 8 years ago. Reverend Dr. Virginia Ward will tell you, if you work for an university and you meet these students from all different ethnic backgrounds, everybody will call you to speak in every context. And so I showed up at an Indian Pentecostal church of 800 people. I am the only Black person. I know nothing about South Asian culture aside from what my South Asian college students have told me over the years. And so I arrived at this retreat center. There's a bunch of college students there. Some of them are alumni, so I recognize a handful of them, but not a whole lot. And I walk in and I ask, just kind of some of the basics. Tell me about your church, tell me about some of your community, tell me about the needs and concerns. And they give me all the information ahead of time. I asked some folks afresh when I got there. And then, as someone was preparing to speak, I sat down. I found the first empty spot, sat down, and I'm looking over my message and getting ready. And I looked up and there was an Indian, a South Asian woman standing beside me. And there was another South Asian woman standing beside me. And there was one in front of me and there was one behind me, which one I stopped and turned around and looked and realized I was sitting where the women were. That in South Asian culture, because they were first generation, the men don't sit with the women. And I found the first empty chair. I am sitting amongst 300 South Asian women. And one of the guys just came over. He didn't ask me to move. He just came and stood beside me, which was terrifying for him because he's never sat with women in the 60 years he had been on the earth. That's how the older generation was. The younger generation is up top. iPhones out. They're texting each other. The boys and the girls are sitting beside each other. No problem. And as the weekend progressed, I changed my message because they wanted me to talk about, what's something that we can do to inspire the young people? What can we do to charge them up? They have forgotten like their cultural values. They're too American. They're more American than they are Indian or South Asian. None of them speak the dialect, the Malayali. And so we've got to be able to have a conversation with them. And I felt like the Lord gave me a word for them. And it was just simply, like, you all need each other. I was like, the elders, you need the energy and the fire and the passion of the young folks. Young folks, it took me a while to realize that I'm not old, but I'm older, and youth is wasted on the young. You need the wisdom of your elders if we are going to make it. And when it was done, the senior pastor of that congregation, he said, you told them what I have been afraid to say for like the last 5 years. He said, it's very difficult for us to be able to speak to our elders in that way directly because it's seen as a rebuke. And he said, I can't get the young kids to listen to me. So for you to be able to come in and be here for 48 hours and see the old people want to work with the young people and vice versa, but they're not talking to each other, he said, thank you. And so I think when we look at the Black community, I remember I was viscerally allergic when this first started. Not the Trayvon Martin murder, but I think when Michael Brown, Eric Garner, Tamir Rice, John Crawford, you started to see like the memes and the shirts come up. This ain't your mama's civil rights movement, right? There was some ownership of it. And some of that is like Black church, like in the Black church, you were 40 and still in the young adult ministry. Right? So there's some sense in which we don't recognize the adultness of each other until you get married and have kids and have more gray hair than you have black hair, you're a baby. That's because how they were taught and vice versa. And so when we finally get in power, we own that thing and hold on to it. But the younger generation, for them to think this ain't your mama's civil rights movement, it is. It is one civil rights movement from slavery through Jim Crow, through the civil rights movement to mass incarceration, the Black Lives Matter. This is one singular story. As James Baldwin said, the story of America is the story of Black people in America, and it is not a good story. And so there's some sense in which I think we have got to be able to recognize across generations, we need each other. There's an older Black staff with InterVarsity. His name is Bishop Tony Warner. And I remember when I was on staff, there were some issues going on in the organization, some systemic and structural issues. And I was getting fired up and passionate. And I wanted to be able to send emails and talk to leadership. And Bishop is like, he was one of 2 Black staff in the country back in the 1950s and 60s. There were only 2 nationwide, and he was one of them. He's still on staff. And so I'm fired up and passionate. And Bishop looked at me and said, Sean, you're asking the wrong questions. I asked those questions 30 years ago. And I had to humble myself and realize this conversation has been going on longer than I've been alive. I need to recognize what questions were asked, what questions were answered, what questions were not answered. Where are we right now? Because otherwise we're going to be repeating the same process of old. And so there's some sense in which, again, I think the younger generation needs the older generation. There's a wisdom that can be poured out. I think where Black Lives Matter, if I can be bold enough to say it failed, is in the sense that they didn't follow the 4 principles that Dr. King talked about. Has there been an injustice? Have you met with governmental officials to ask that injustice be changed? If they say no, you consecrate yourself, and then you prepare for civil disobedience with the expectation that we will continue until said injustice is corrected. This generation, to be blunt, and I saw my students do it, they will march, they will protest, they will take a selfie, and then they will go back to work. And that's really not how you bring about systemic and structural change. You've got to have people who are talking to the politicians and talking to governmental and elected leaders. And you've also got to engage in civil disobedience. It can't just be a Facebook post. It can't just be, sadly, a riot, which is the language of the unheard. You've got to combine those. You've got to have a strategic plan in place. And what concerns me is because we have such a microwave generation right now, because everything comes to us instantaneously, that we're not prepared for the long haul of what it means to bring about systemic and structural change. The older generation is, but some of them have seen a lot and they don't want to go through this again. They're ready to sit down, retire. They marched and protested for a long time, and they're not willing to risk the third and fourth quarter of their lives. And so I think there's got to be a difficult conversation that has to happen in the Black community that says we need each other. We need the energy of the youth. We need the wisdom of the old. But we both have to be able to show up, because America needs to see the totality of our lives and our families and our generation. We are fighting the same battle, and America has not answered in the way in which it needs to for its citizens, its Black and brown citizens especially. I think with respect to the white community, yes, I would agree with you. I I put on Facebook 3 days ago, I am not having a level 1 conversation with anybody white. And I stand by that. That is a healthy boundary that I had. I talked to every white person I could in 2012 when Trayvon Martin was killed. I've got 4,000 Facebook friends right now. Most of them are white people that I have never met before, or I met one time at a conference, and I am their Black resource. And that is emotionally exhausting. What I said in a podcast that I just recorded for Subculture was Gustavo Gonzalez talks about this in his book, Santa Biblia, the Bible through Hispanic eyes. And he has this amazing illustration of Genesis 22. He says, you can do an expositional interpretation of the text, a hermeneutical one, just, from that perspective. Genesis 22, God speaking to Abraham, take Isaac, your son that you love, go sacrifice him on the mountain of Moriah. Obviously, Abraham goes up the mountain, prepares to sacrifice his son. He doesn't ram in the bush. God says, now I know you fear God. I won't withhold anything from you. I will give you the sevenfold blessing that I promised in Genesis 12. And so obviously, any good sermon on the text will come from Abraham's perspective, right? What does it mean to trust God? You've been waiting 25 years for this son. You're willing to sacrifice him. What does it mean to be Isaac? To have your father that you love sacrifice your life or call you to lay your life down? Can you trust that your father knows what he's doing? Like Job said, though he slay me, yet will I trust him. We can even come from Sarah's perspective. Sarah dies in the very next chapter. And most female theologians say a mama knows when her baby is in danger. They can feel it. And so even though she's not mentioned in the text, the fact that she dies in the very next chapter, something is going on in Sarah's heart as that 90-year-old woman waited for a child to be born. Any good theologian, you can come from any of those perspectives. Well, Gustavo Gonzalez says, from a cultural perspective, in Genesis 22, we are not Abraham, we are not Isaac, we are not Sarah, we are the ram in the bush. We are the one that gets sacrificed in order for the dominant culture, in this case, white people, to be able to learn the issues of racism and injustice. And I referenced Genesis 22 in that podcast because what happens in Genesis 22? You have a father, you have a son, and you have the blood of a ram on the altar. And what happened in February? You had a father, you had a son, and you have innocent Black blood spilled in the street.